Let's start with something brutally honest. When someone hurts you deeply, emotionally, and then disappears, your nervous system doesn't just feel pain. It registers trauma. It's like a ghost signal echoing in your brain's circuitry with no closure, no explanation, and absolutely no accountability. You text, you call, you cry. They stay silent. And you wonder, why would someone hurt me and then act like I don't exist? Here's the hard truth. They're not wired like you. Let's zoom in and really break down what's happening beneath the surface. Neurologically, psychologically, when a narcissist ignores you after they've hurt you. It's easy to look at this situation on the surface and assume it's indifference or forgetfulness. But what we see in the data, and more importantly, in the lived experience of people, is something far more calculated, something more deeply rooted in how their nervous system is wired. Narcissists don't interact with others the way healthy individuals do. They're not looking for connection, they're looking for control. That's not an exaggeration. It's a fundamental difference in the way their brain processes emotional relationships. For most people, emotional closeness releases oxytocin, the bonding chemical, and strengthens the reward circuitry associated with mutual trust and vulnerability. But in narcissistic individuals, studies show a reduced response in these same regions. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventromedial area, which is crucial for moral decision-making and empathy, operates differently. The patterns that show up on scans or even in real-world interactions point to a brain that sees people not as partners in connection, but as tools in a system of leverage. So when they hurt you and then ignore you afterward, it's not because they're overwhelmed by guilt or wrestling with their conscience. It's because they believe the damage has already done its job. In their eyes, your pain equals their power. The silence that follows is the strategy. It's how they maintain the upper hand. They're not wondering if you're okay. They're wondering if you'll reach out. They're wondering how many hours, how many days, how many messages you'll send before you finally break under the pressure of not being acknowledged. And that silence, what we often interpret as absence, is actually a form of presence, a powerful one. Because when someone disappears after causing pain, they leave a void. That void begins to occupy your mental and emotional space. It's the unanswered question that your brain keeps trying to resolve. The silence echoes louder than any words they could have spoken. What's incredible and tragic is how our nervous system responds to this. When we're ignored by someone we're emotionally attached to, especially after a rupture, our threat detection system lights up, the amygdala becomes hyperactive, cortisol levels rise, your heart rate may increase, sleep may become disrupted. That's because the human brain is wired to respond to social abandonment as a survival threat. In the evolutionary sense, isolation meant death. So when someone close to you, someone who's supposed to care, suddenly goes cold, your body doesn't interpret that as a minor social annoyance. It experiences it as danger. Now, add to that the narcissist's timing. They don't usually ignore you after a calm conversation or a resolved conflict. They go dark after chaos, after emotional volatility, after they've pushed you to your edge. And then, just when your system is destabilized, when you're emotionally raw and cognitively overloaded, they retreat. Why? Because the more unsettled you are, the more they can shape the narrative later. Your memory of the event gets fragmented by stress. Your logic gets hijacked by the emotional brain. They know this. Whether consciously or not, they know. And this is where things get even more unsettling. The narcissist often positions themselves as the calm one, the one who needed space, or who didn't want to make things worse. This reversal flips the script. It casts you as the unstable one and them as the emotionally regulated observer. But it's not regulation, it's detachment. They're not calm because they've mastered themselves. They're calm because they feel nothing about the damage they caused. That's not maturity, that's emotional vacancy. And your nervous system feels that even if your mind tries to rationalize it. Understanding this difference between someone who seeks connection versus someone who seeks control is the first step toward liberation. Because once you see the game, you stop playing it. You stop trying to decode the silence or take the blame for the break. You stop personalizing their withdrawal as proof of your inadequacy. And that shift, that subtle but seismic shift, is where healing begins. See, control-based relationships can only survive if the other person remains unaware. But once awareness sets in, once the mind starts to map the manipulation, something powerful happens. The grip weakens. The silence no longer controls. The confusion begins to clear. And what's left isn't just space, it's sovereignty. It's the beginning of emotional autonomy. They weren't the medicine. They were the wound. There's a reason people stay stuck after narcissistic abuse. Why they can't stop thinking, rethinking, overanalyzing. It's not just emotional, it's chemical. The silence that comes after the hurt isn't just offensive, it's addictive. And what we often underestimate is how this silence hijacks your brain's reward system in a way that's strikingly similar to how addiction works. Not metaphorically, literally. Let's talk about the dopamine system. Dopamine is often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical, but that's not really accurate. Dopamine is about anticipation. It's what drives motivation, craving, pursuit. It's the molecule of maybe. And narcissists know exactly how to weaponize that maybe. They hurt you, then vanish. And that absence creates uncertainty. Your brain, in its need for closure and connection, starts scanning, searching, obsessing. You check your phone, you refresh messages, you analyze the last thing they said. Not because you're weak, not because you're needy, but because your dopamine circuits have been hijacked by unpredictability. Now here's where it gets particularly cruel. The human brain is more activated by intermittent reinforcement than consistent patterns. In other words, when the reward is unpredictable, when love comes, then vanishes, then reappears unexpectedly, your dopamine levels spike higher than if you received love steadily. This is why slot machines work. This is why people stay stuck in cycles with narcissists. You're not addicted to the person. You're addicted to the uncertainty of their validation. Every time they respond after ignoring you, it feels like a win. Your brain gets a reward hit, not because the interaction was healthy, but because it interrupted the agony of silence. And so over time, your brain starts to associate them with relief, not joy, not peace, just the end of craving. That relief is powerful, but it's not love. It's withdrawal ending. It's a chemical calm that makes you believe something meaningful just happened, when in fact, nothing was resolved at all. What's more, that cycle becomes embedded. Your brain learns the pattern: hurt, silence, craving, relief, repeat. The neural circuits reinforce themselves, just like in substance addiction. You start chasing contact not because it's good, but because the absence is unbearable. And that's not your fault. That's what intermittent reinforcement does to a nervous system that's wired for connection. Now imagine this happening again and again. They say something cruel. They accuse you, gaslight you, blame you. Then they go silent. Days pass. No explanation, no apology. And just when you begin to detach or even breathe, they send a one-line message, thinking about you, hope you're okay. That's not kindness. That's bait. That's the reactivation of the cycle, because they don't want resolution. They want re-engagement. And here's the devastating part. Every time you take the bait, your nervous system gets further conditioned to expect chaos. Calm feels foreign. Peace feels boring. Your sense of normal becomes distorted. That's the long-term effect of a nervous system trapped in unpredictability. The highs and lows of the relationship become your emotional climate, and your brain adapts by staying on edge, hypervigilant, restless, craving. It's not that you don't see what's happening, you probably do, but biology overrides logic. You can understand that someone is toxic and still feel drawn to them. That's not confusion, it's the neurochemical reality of emotional trauma. It's your dopamine system running loops that were never meant to be part of a healthy bond. But the good news is this: once you see the mechanism, you can interrupt it. You can start to rewire. You can starve the pattern. It doesn't mean the craving disappears overnight. It won't. Your brain needs time to down-regulate those circuits, to unlearn the chaos and relearn stability. That happens with time, repetition, and the refusal to feed the loop again. This is why silence hurts so much when it comes from someone who's hurt you. It's not just absence. It's a continuation of the manipulation. It's the craving that silence produces that keeps you hooked. And they know that, even if they never say it aloud. They know there's a particular kind of emotional trap that many people don't recognize until they're already in too deep. It's subtle, it's disorienting, and it's incredibly powerful. I'm talking about trauma bonding, the neurological tether that forms between you and the person causing you pain. And once this bond forms, it doesn't feel like fear or confusion. It feels like love. It feels like urgency, longing, intensity, but it's not love in its healthy form. It's a chemically induced illusion that's built on extreme emotional highs and lows, and your brain quite literally gets rewired to crave the very person causing the distress. Let's break down what actually happens. When a narcissist cycles between affection and cruelty, what they're really doing is triggering two major systems in your body: the stress system and the reward system. First, the stress. When conflict erupts through yelling, gaslighting, accusations, or emotional withdrawal, your body floods with cortisol. Your amygdala activates, your heart rate spikes, your nervous system moves into a state of high alert, what we call sympathetic arousal, fight or flight. Your body registers that something is deeply wrong. But then, out of nowhere, the same person who caused that spike in distress suddenly flip. They apologize, offer affection, or momentarily return to the charming, charismatic version of themselves. That swing, the shift from fear to warmth, floods your system with oxytocin and dopamine. And in that moment, the brain links relief to reunion. It tags reconnection as the cure for pain. This isn't just emotional conditioning. This is neurochemical imprinting. The abuser becomes both the source of pain and the source of comfort. That's the definition of a trauma bond. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the deeper this pattern goes, the more you start to normalize it. Your brain begins to expect instability. You brace for impact, and then you chase the repair. And when the repair comes, even if it's shallow, even if it's manipulative, your nervous system rewards you with a sense of calm, however brief. That calm feels like love, but it's not love. It's the crash after the cortisol spike. And because it's unpredictable, because it's not guaranteed, it feels rare, which makes it feel valuable. This is how the trauma bond strengthens over time. The narcissist, meanwhile, understands this rhythm. They may not talk about it in scientific terms, but they know what works. They know that a kind word after days of silence will feel like a rescue. They know that a soft touch after emotional abuse will feel like redemption, but it's not real healing. It's just enough relief to keep you from leaving. And the longer it continues, the more the bond deepens, not through intimacy, but through survival. See, healthy relationships are built on consistency, on trust, on the repeated experience of emotional safety. Trauma bonds are built on the exact opposite: instability, confusion, and false hope. And because your brain gets conditioned by repeated experience, it eventually learns to crave not the person, but the pattern. You become addicted to the cycle itself, the rupture, the silence, the repair. The cycle becomes your baseline. And anything outside of that, calm, steady love, feels foreign. It feels boring. You may even begin to sabotage those healthier dynamics because your nervous system has been so deeply wired to equate chaos with care. What's even more insidious is that the narcissist will often frame this bond as a testament to your connection. They'll say things like, "No one else understands me like you do," or "We fight because we care so much." But that's not passion. That's trauma disguised as intensity. Real love doesn't require suffering. It doesn't feed on your nervous system's exhaustion. It doesn't make you prove your worth through pain. And this is where the healing begins. When you start to recognize that what you're feeling is not love, but dependency. A dependency created by chemicals, by your own biology responding to a cycle that was never meant to exist in the first place. When you start to identify the pattern, not just the person, you gain leverage over the bond. And when you stop chasing relief from the same source that caused the pain, the chemicals begin to settle. The bond begins to weaken. It takes time, it takes space, and most of all, it takes understanding that your brain was doing its best to keep you safe in an environment that was anything but safe. That craving you feel after the silence, after the fight, after the discard, that's not love asking for more. That's trauma asking for relief. And the more you can recognize that, the more power you reclaim. What most people don't realize is that emotional pain doesn't just hurt. It physically registers in the body the same way a broken bone does. That's not a metaphor. That's observable in brain scans. When someone close to you wounds you emotionally, especially through betrayal, rejection, or abandonment, the exact same neural circuits light up as when you suffer physical injury. Specifically, the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex, which are both heavily involved in processing physical pain, become activated. So when a narcissist discards you or suddenly vanishes after causing harm, your brain responds as if you've been physically attacked. The body can't tell the difference between heartbreak and blunt force. That's how real it is. Now think about that in the context of what happens after you've been hurt. They don't check in, they don't follow up, they don't offer closure. There's no bandage, no splint, no emotional care, just absence. The nervous system enters into a state of confusion and alarm. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making and rational thought, begins to disconnect from the emotional centers. That's why in these moments, your thoughts become foggy, your memory starts to distort, and you find yourself looping through the same questions over and over. What happened? Why did they stop caring? Did I do something wrong? It's not just rumination, it's neurological disorientation. You are trying to regulate without resolution. And because emotional pain activates the same circuits as physical pain, the body starts to demand relief. But here's the paradox. The only person who seems capable of ending the pain is the very person who caused it. That's when the cravings intensify. You reach out, you send that message, not because you don't understand what they did to you, but because your system is trying to stop the hurt. You're not looking for love in that moment. You're looking for anesthesia. And unfortunately, narcissists understand this, even if they don't articulate it that way. They know they can become the relief to the pain they created. That's why their absence is such an effective tool. It keeps you tethered to the hope of pain relief, not true connection. And let's be clear, this isn't something that just resolves on its own. Emotional wounds, when left unacknowledged, become chronic. They lodge themselves into your sense of identity. They shape how you interpret future experiences. You begin to expect abandonment. You anticipate betrayal. The anterior cingulate cortex becomes hypersensitive over time, meaning you start feeling pain even in situations where none exists. A delayed response from a friend, a neutral tone in a text, an ambiguous silence, all of it gets processed as threat. Not because you're overreacting, but because your nervous system has been primed by repeated emotional injuries that never healed. This is the residue of emotional neglect, the hurt that doesn't bleed, but still bruises, still swells, still scars. And when it comes from someone you trusted, someone who once said they cared, it's even more damaging because the betrayal violates not just your sense of safety, but your sense of reality. You start to doubt your own instincts. You question your emotional memory. Did it really happen the way I think it did? Were they really that cruel? Did I imagine it? This psychological splitting, where you oscillate between believing your pain and dismissing it, is the mind trying to protect itself from emotional chaos it can't resolve. And when they finally resurface, as they often do, it creates another layer of confusion. The brain is so starved for validation that even the slightest attention can feel like a rescue, but it's not. It's a re-injury waiting to happen. Because without true empathy, without repair, that interaction isn't healing anything. It's just reopening the same neural wounds that were never given time or space to truly close. This is why understanding the biology of emotional pain matters. Because once you see that your reaction isn't weakness, but wiring, you stop blaming yourself for struggling. You stop labeling yourself as dramatic or too sensitive. You realize your pain is valid, measurable, traceable, and entirely human. And that awareness, as simple as it sounds, is the beginning of freedom. You stop needing their validation to believe in your pain. You stop needing their presence to justify your absence of peace. It's one of the hardest things to accept, that the very qualities that make you good, kind, and deeply human can also make you a target. Empathy is not just a moral strength, it's a neural trait. Your mirror neuron system, the part of your brain that lights up when you observe someone else's emotions, is highly tuned. It's what allows you to feel others' pain, to read between the lines, to intuitively sense when something's wrong, even when nothing is said. That's not weakness. That's evolutionary brilliance. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Narcissists don't experience that system the same way. And not only do they not feel empathy the way you do, they often see your empathy as a tool, something they can use, manipulate, twist to serve their own needs. When someone is capable of emotionally attuning to others, they often lead with compassion. They assume misunderstandings can be cleared, wounds can be healed, and good intentions can be restored. But narcissists see this emotional openness not as a shared space for connection, but as leverage. The moment you show vulnerability, especially when it's tied to a wound they've caused, they don't instinctively lean in to comfort. Instead, they register an opportunity. Your desire for reconciliation becomes their psychological playground. The mistake many people make is assuming that when someone hurts them and then sees them in pain, they'll feel remorse. But remorse requires access to emotional depth. It requires discomfort with having caused harm. And while narcissists often have what's called cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what others are feeling, they lack affective empathy. That means they can recognize your sadness, your confusion, your anxiety. They just don't feel it with you. That emotional distance allows them to observe your pain like someone watching a movie. They see it, they may even comment on it, but it doesn't move them. Now, take a person like you, someone who feels deeply, who wants to believe that everyone has good inside them, and put you in front of someone like that. The dynamic becomes dangerously unbalanced. You keep reaching out with sincerity, and they keep pulling back with silence. You offer understanding, and they return with blame. And over time, your brain begins to collapse the distinction between kindness and pain. You start to equate love with effort, empathy with exhaustion. You try harder, you give more. You rationalize their behavior, not because it makes sense, but because the alternative, that someone could hurt you and feel nothing, feels too devastating to accept. The tragedy here is that many people confuse empathy with compatibility. But compatibility requires mutual care, mutual recognition. And a narcissist doesn't meet you at that level. They operate on a different frequency altogether. What you're offering, your patience, your forgiveness, your desire to repair, they don't see that as noble. They see it as exploitable. And the more you give, the more they take. Not because they need it, but because it confirms something for them, that they are in control. This is where the cycle begins to turn toxic. You give out of love, they take out of ego. And when the taking doesn't stop, you start to wonder if you're the problem. You try to fix yourself, adjust yourself, shrink yourself to avoid another rupture. That's the loop where empathy becomes self-erasure and your ability to feel others becomes the very thing that disconnects you from yourself. But here's what has to be said plainly. Your empathy is not the issue. It never was. The problem is not that you felt too much. It's that they felt too little. You weren't too sensitive. You were just standing in front of someone emotionally bankrupt, trying to make sense of silence using a heart that speaks in full sentences. That mismatch is painful, but it's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their limitation. Healing begins when you stop negotiating your empathy in exchange for crumbs. When you stop trying to prove that your love is strong enough to change someone who doesn't see love as anything more than a transaction. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you is the moment you begin returning to your own nervous system, to your own emotional truth. There's a moment that many people overlook when dealing with a narcissist, when the person who caused you harm suddenly disappears, doesn't respond, says nothing, does nothing. It feels like rejection, like emotional absence. But in reality, that silence isn't passive. It's deliberate. It's not an accident. It's a tactic. And understanding that can completely reframe your experience of what feels like abandonment. Let's talk about how the brain responds to silence, especially silence after emotional injury. Most people assume silence is avoidance, but in many narcissistic dynamics, it's actually part of the control loop. When someone pulls away right after a rupture, they're not giving space for reflection or healing. They're calculating. They're measuring the impact of their absence on your nervous system, because silence isn't just the absence of words. It's the creation of anxiety. And for a narcissist, your anxiety is a form of control. Here's what happens neurologically. The moment you're ignored, especially by someone who's hurt you and then vanished, your amygdala, which detects threats, starts to fire. The brain enters a state of hypervigilance, scanning for cues. You replay what you said, what you did. You overanalyze texts, phone calls, even your own reactions. That mental loop isn't overthinking. It's a natural outcome of your brain trying to find closure in a situation where none has been offered. Now add the layer of emotional dependence that narcissists often foster. They know how to hook you, not by giving constant love, but by delivering it in unpredictable doses. You never know when they will engage or disappear. So when they go silent after hurting you, your body isn't just missing their voice or presence. Your nervous system is entering a state of withdrawal. And just like with a substance, that withdrawal creates craving. That craving doesn't always feel like love. It often feels like confusion, panic, desperation. But those feelings are what keep you attached to them. Not because of what they provide, but because of what they withhold. And that's the point. Their silence isn't the end of the conversation. It's part of the manipulation. By not responding, they're communicating. They're saying, you're not worth an answer, or worse, you need me more than I need you. And because the human brain is wired to seek resolution, to close the gap in understanding, you lean in harder. You text again. You apologize. Even when you didn't do anything wrong, you start negotiating with their silence, which is exactly what they want. We often assume people ignore us because they don't care, but in this context, they ignore you because they do care about control. The lack of contact is designed to destabilize you, to shift the emotional weight back in their direction. Suddenly, you're not even thinking about the original hurt. You're just thinking about how to get a response. That shift, when your goal moves from resolution to re-engagement, is where they regain power. This is especially true when the silence comes after a confrontation, after you've set a boundary or voiced a need. Rather than engage with you like an equal in that moment, they disengage entirely. Not because they're overwhelmed, but because they want to reset the dynamic. They want to force you to chase them, because in that chase, you're less likely to hold them accountable. You're too focused on the reconnection to revisit the injury. and the silence has done its job. It's important to understand that this kind of silence is not neutral. It's a strategy, a weapon. It creates enough discomfort in your system that you begin to doubt yourself. And once you're in that self-doubt spiral, they've already won. Because now, instead of staying grounded in your truth, you're grasping for theirs. You're trying to earn their attention, their approval, their affection. But none of that comes from a place of love. It comes from a place of power imbalance that they've carefully constructed and reinforced with every carefully timed silence. The shift begins when you stop interpreting silence as a void to fill and start recognizing it as a message in itself. When you stop chasing after someone who uses absence as a means of control, you take back the space to hear your own voice. You reconnect to your own signals, your breath, your anxiety, your instinct. You stop translating silence into guilt and start translating it into data. Because what someone does in your moment of vulnerability reveals far more about them than what they say when things are easy. There's a moment that happens in so many of these cycles, and it catches people off guard every time. You finally started to breathe again. You're sleeping a little better. The racing thoughts are slowing down. Maybe you've gone a day or two without checking your phone to see if they texted. Your appetite is returning. You're stabilizing. And just as you begin to reclaim your balance, they return out of nowhere. A message, a call, just thinking about you. And your nervous system lights up, not with joy, but with confusion, maybe even dread. That moment isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern. It's a calculated re-entry that happens when your brain begins to heal from the chaos. And while it may feel spontaneous or coincidental on the surface, underneath, it's often incredibly intentional. Narcissists can sense distance, not necessarily through psychic ability or awareness, but through behavioral cues. The silence they initiated, it had a purpose. It was meant to create dependence, longing, uncertainty. But when that silence stops working, when you stop reaching out, stop reacting, stop needing their response, that shift doesn't go unnoticed. That's the moment they come back. What we're talking about here is the reactivation of the trauma loop. It's not random. It's the disruption of healing, and it usually arrives disguised as care. The timing is what gives it away. They don't reach out when you're broken and begging. They reach out when you're rebuilding. When your mind is trying to separate the pain from the attachment. When your nervous system is, little by little, finding regulation again. Because healing represents a threat to their control. You being okay without them breaks the narrative they've spent so much time constructing, that they're the one who validates your worth, your peace, your stability. From a neurological perspective, your body starts to recalibrate once you're away from the cycle. Cortisol levels drop, dopamine stops being erratic. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reason, planning, reflection, comes back online. You start to think more clearly. You remember things as they actually happen, not how you were made to perceive them. And then suddenly, when you're on the edge of breakthrough, they slide back in, and your nervous system gets hit with a storm. The body remembers the craving, the stress loop kicks in again. And even if you don't want to go back, a part of you feels pulled to respond, to re-engage, to make sense of the sudden return. But this isn't a return rooted in care. It's a return rooted in disruption. Because the narcissist's sense of connection isn't based on mutual love or respect. It's based on their ability to access your attention. Once that access begins to shut down, once you're no longer reacting, needing, responding, that's when their grip weakens. And they feel that. It's not that they miss you, it's that they miss the feeling of being able to pull your strings. So they show up with just enough warmth to reignite hope, a short message, a vague apology, a picture from the past. It's not closure, it's bait. It's not resolution, it's reset. Because if they can get you to feel confused again, to wonder what they really meant, to hope maybe they've changed. They've re-entered the cycle, and your healing gets put on hold. The tragedy is we're biologically wired to hope. That's what keeps us human. The nervous system doesn't just respond to safety, it reaches for it, even when it's hurt, even when it's been lied to. That's why their return can feel comforting, even when intellectually you know it's dangerous. You're not going back because you forgot the pain. You're going back because your body is still detoxing from the manipulation, and they offer the only thing that temporarily relieves it. But every time they return and you re-engage, the wound stays open. It doesn't matter how sweet the words are, how soft their tone is. If there's no change in behavior, no accountability, no evidence of repair, then their return is just a continuation of the same pattern. And your nervous system gets thrown back into dysregulation. All the calm you worked for, all the clarity you fought to earn begins to dissolve. The shift, the real healing, comes when you recognize this pattern, not just intellectually, but physically. When your body starts to signal, this isn't love, this is re-injury. That's when you begin to trust yourself again. When you stop waiting for a better version of them and start creating a better version of your boundaries. Because their return isn't a gift, it's a test. And when you stop answering, you pass. There's something profoundly empowering, almost life-altering, that happens when you realize your brain isn't fixed. It adapts, it changes, it rewires itself based on the experiences you feed it, the environments you expose it to, and the decisions you make consistently over time. And that means the damage inflicted by narcissistic abuse, the trauma loops, the emotional cravings, the psychological confusion, is not permanent. The brain that was once trained to seek validation from the person who hurt you, that responded to silence like a threat and clung to intermittent affection like oxygen, can actually learn a new way of being, a safer, calmer, clearer way of existing. That process is called neuroplasticity. And it's not just theoretical, it's physical, it's chemical, and it's possible for every single person who's been through this kind of manipulation. The reason this matters so much is because when someone has been emotionally wounded by a narcissist, the pain doesn't end when the person leaves. In fact, for many people, the hardest part comes after the narcissist is gone. That's when the nervous system starts to experience the withdrawal, when the brain tries to reconcile all the contradictions, love that felt like violence, apologies that felt like bait, attention that always came at a cost. And in the middle of that storm, it's easy to believe you're broken, that you'll always crave them, that you'll never feel peace unless they somehow come back and fix what they broke. But that's not true. You don't need their apology to heal. You need to stop reinforcing the pathways in your brain that are still wired to expect their chaos. Healing begins when you stop seeking emotional resolution from someone who is committed to confusion. But that's not just a decision. It's a retraining of your neural circuits. You have to teach your brain that calm is safe, that silence without manipulation is normal, that distance doesn't mean abandonment, that love doesn't have to hurt. And this happens through very specific, intentional shifts in your daily behavior. Every time you don't respond to the bait, you weaken the trauma loop. Every time you choose a calm environment over one filled with volatility, you reduce the brain's dependence on stress chemicals. Every time you practice stillness, grounding, or even just deep, intentional breathing, you are literally sending signals to your body that you are no longer in danger. It doesn't happen all at once. There will be moments when the cravings return, when your body wants to reach out, when the silence feels unbearable, when the flashbacks hit without warning. That's normal. That's just the old wiring still running its script. But over time, as you keep choosing stability, those neural circuits begin to prune, they shrink. And new circuits, ones that associate safety with boundaries, joy with autonomy, and love with respect, begin to strengthen. You begin to feel what it's like to wake up without a pit in your stomach. You begin to sleep through the night without the obsessive urge to check your phone. You begin to smile without permission. And something else shifts. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop needing to be understood by the person who refused to hear you when it mattered, because your nervous system isn't screaming anymore. Your body isn't begging for closure. The quiet inside of you is no longer the product of suppression. It's the result of repair. People think healing means forgetting. It doesn't. The memories stay. The pain doesn't vanish. But the meaning changes. The story you tell yourself about what happened and who you are begins to evolve. You stop identifying with the version of yourself that was stuck and start becoming the version that chose to walk away. Not because you didn't love them, but because you finally loved yourself enough to stop bleeding for someone who never intended to stop the wound. That's the real freedom. Not the absence of memory, but the absence of craving. Not the silence of them being gone, but the silence in your own body, steady, grounded, and no longer waiting for the next unpredictable hit of affection. That freedom isn't given to you, it's built. One moment, one decision, one neural pattern at a time, and every step you take away from their chaos, every step you take back toward your own body is proof that your healing was never in their hands. It was in your nervous system all along.